Hello everyone, today we make a brief introduction of early medieval Transylvania, starting naturally from late Roman times. As you know, I made a video that is quite popularly algorithmic now about Trans-Danubian Dacia and the origins of the Romanian people. Those are the kind of videos that for some reason always get lots of views. And as an introduction to this video introduction, you can use that because fundamentally we analyze the broader say historiographical issues at some level regarding the emergence of this essentially Romance island in otherwise a sea of mostly Slavs, but also Ugro-Finnic in the west, and languages and peoples, broadly speaking, as that fundamentally also one of the main indicators, aside from the genetic one, that tells us always a very stratified history. But this is not, in fact, the point. We will talk partially about this in the video, but this is basically just an introduction to the history of Transylvania, as it actually begins in the 11th century. I mean, that's when our sources start calling the country properly as Ultra Silvam, right? We're in the third quarter of the 11th century from a medieval Latin document of the Kingdom of Hungary. So there are different names, right? In the Gesta Hungarorum we find Terra Ultra Silvana, so land beyond the forest, and this name stems also from what the Hungarian vernacular word was used to define this land in the heart of the Carpathian Basin as Erdeli. That is to say, in fact, the land that lays beyond the forest, right? Erdel in Hungarian meaning forest, and Elf beyond. So it's just like eventually was Latinized, and in German, right, equally Überwald, given the Saxon colonization that, as you know, took place intensely in the late Middle Ages. Especially, it means literally the same thing. And Transylvania is known in the same linguistical toponym as in Romanian, that is Ardel, derived from the Hungarian Erdeli, and the same in Serbian, in Croatian, and even in Turkish, right? So the point is that this is fairly, let's say, isolated country in Europe, at least in the general sense that it was not a broader open plain. In fact, it's surrounded by the Carpathian Mountains and by the Silva, in fact, by the forests. If you look at a map of Romania's forest ecozones, you can see that fundamentally the same Carpathian Basin is fundamentally, especially in the within and from the Hungarian side, so where from which eventually the name comes from, is surrounded by forests, right? Beech and sessile oak mixed forest, mostly Hungarian oak and mixtures or high on medium hills, right? So it's like a bit of a heart, surrounded in fact by more plain areas, because in the east you have fundamentally the beginning of the steppes, in the south you have Wallachia and the Danubian valley that is more open. In the west you also have the Pannonian plain, in the north you have the Polish plain. So in many ways this stands out as a sort of fortress on its own, and it's been the history of this country since antiquity, as a matter of fact. I mean, if you think about the Dacians that were very well entrenched, also prospering thanks to the mineral resources of the land that were fundamentally the only attractive resource for conquerors that struggled always to maintain a control on the land. But it was difficult to maintain because, again, it was well sheltered, and also from the within there was hardly, yes, there are several river valleys, but the the country in this sense is somewhat also broken in various parts, so it's hard to properly control it. So as we will see also in the video we will make hopefully about the later medieval history of Transylvania, this region was part of the Kingdom of Hungary, right in the easternmost frontier, and Transylvania had an easternmost frontier herself, as we will see, that was settled by the Szekelyes. As you know, this famous ethnicity that today is considered a Hungarian subgroup, and there was an effort of Romanianization, let's say, over time, but historically there is this feeling, this identity connected with the older steppes rulers, especially the Huns, right? And there are lots of interesting ethnological, let's say, considerations to make. We will make perhaps separated videos about the Szekelyes themselves, that are just one of the many peoples that inhabited the area. That is considerable a frontier after all, because while it is true that, of course, geography offered this kind of very defined boundary to the country, as we've seen, the same country was not like a center of a broader, power capacity that, at least compared to the neighbors, that thus could easily withstand also the basically endless waves of peoples from the steppes, and that, in a sense, also derived from this, in part, paradoxically, its same autonomy, because there could be some very interesting interplay with whoever at that point could cooperate with them, right? I made a video about Moldavia, as a matter of fact, and there was a general effort from this kind of sedentary European realities, of course, to stem the nomadic, semi-nomadic invasions, and successfully so, because at the end of the day, no nomad eventually remains so once settled in Europe, and that's the history of the same Huns, of the same Avars, the same Magyars, and there is an extraordinary continuity, especially in the Pannonian Basin, sometimes properly with the political and social organization, in part also with the same ethnicities, given, of course, that there was always a prevalent kind of, European base, in spite of the kind of steppe influences in there. And Transylvania fits partly that too. And the problem for this first half of the medieval millennium is that, of course, we don't know too much about what happened there. That's also why the ethnic issue is so hotly debated still to this day, aside from the political, nationalistic manipulations from anybody involved, and so that at the end of the day always reactivates here and there, and especially in countries that had the specific history of the Balkans, even though Transylvania is not geographically in the Balkans, but that, as you know, with the term Balkanization we used to define in this broader kind of conflictual sense, if you want. Naturally, I'm brutally summarizing, but each of these topics deserves an enormous set of video lessons, because they are radically important, I think, for European history in general and the future of a united European power. In any case, we start, of course, from the Daco-Roman times, because these are the ones that surely left an important mark in the land. This was not a, broadly speaking, completely savage land. Of course, the lands beyond the Danube were, generally speaking, more sparsely populated. They didn't have major road connections like in the Mediterranean. They were less productive in the first place. So the Roman occupation of Dacia, that was, there is a debate even in there. I made actually a video about Trajan and the Dacian Wars, in which I discussed this. Is still debated in the sense of, well, why did they do that? It's because the Dacians were a threat. It's because they wanted the Romans wanted their mines. Was there a broader kind of strategic issue with surrounding peoples, the Sarmatian raids and so on? Well, it's a mix of all this, right? We will not descend into details here. The point is that Rome definitely conquers the Dacian heartland and essentially does Romanize by an important extent the most important centers. As we were saying before, the Dacians were a bit more evolved, say, than the other Central European peoples, in virtue of these local resources and ancient contacts, also with a bit, the Hellenic world that had been kind of more advanced, especially from a commercial point of view. That there had always been very strong contacts since ancient times with Macedon, with the same Rome, of course, that had already by osmosis kind of civilized at least the peoples that could afford an important development like the Dacians beyond the frontiers. And so it was kind of also an exception because, as you know, Rome, aside from the Agri Decumates and the original conquest of Germany, didn't go fundamentally beyond the Danubian and the Rhine frontiers. But the Danube, in particular in the province of Moesia, if you prefer, was essentially the only true fertile Danubian land, and so supporting Romanization, urbanization, and a broader, in fact, productive background that the Dacians threatened, as close as they were, and as politically more compact, as properly a kingdom as they were. So the Romans take it over. And this brings to the region to be sucked into properly the direct process of Romanization. That is to say, there are Daco-Roman elites, there is the spread of Latin and interconnection with the broader empire. And of course, this is an elite work, right? But at the same time, the Romance spreads in these areas, and it will essentially remain in part, and this is what is hotly debated, because as I explained in that video about Transdanubian Dacia, because eventually Aurelian, as you know, when he bailed out from there in the 13th century, in the 3rd century, replicated the province of Dacia from on the right bank of the Danube, as to say, okay, we salvage that conceptually. But the later historians write in times where these lands were already settled, as we will see, by the Goths, by the Huns, etc., and other peoples, also of Iranian stock, the Sarmatians, and so on, point out, Roman historians, that this land was essentially not Roman anymore, for what Roman naturally meant in late antiquity, which is something very complex. Consider that these areas had, generally speaking, undergone, since the 3rd century crisis and also the movements beyond the frontiers, an important impoverishment. I mean, the Danubian region in general becomes also a pretty hotly militarized frontier, so that many areas go depopulated. There is essentially just a pressure from the, as you know, the barbarians to enter the empire, from which they will actually do, talking about the Tervingian gods, exactly from this Gutuda, as it was called, into Roman Thrace, and hence Adrianople, and all the, the first settlement of an entire people, actually, as an autonomous polity within the empire boundaries. We can call it in this way. And the point is that, in fact, for a long time, there is hardly let's say, a sound evidence, macroscopic evidence of the linguistic Romanization of this area throughout, say, in fact, the early, the high Middle Ages, and so on. It is true that there are findings between the 4th and the 7th century, especially some Roman coins, also the Birtan Donarium, which is a 4th century Christian votive object found, in fact, in Transylvania. There's a Latin text saying "Ego Zeno votum posus," so Zenobius offer this gift. These are all votive objects, and other Latin inscriptions in general in early Christian artifacts. We'll talk about the Christianization specifically later. And this provides sufficient evidence that there was still into, in fact, even the 7th century evidence that part of the vulgar Latin-speaking Christian Daco-Roman population had remained in what was the Dacia Traiana and had essentially kept dwelling also in smaller, remote communities. As stressed, this territory is complex. There are many valleys, there are mountains, forests, and it's also a place where lots of peoples that eventually crossed over to other places surely left their trace, right? People say, this area was just, the gods just stayed there for a while and then they went away. Well, there is not even need of any evidence to be obviously sure that there were gods still living there, even after what we call like at least the Visigoths, and later also the Ostrogoths and other peoples had moved on, right? And this region had a specific strategic relevance because there was the Vallum Traiani there, right, which was a set of forts and walls that the Romans had used to defend essentially from all sides except basically the south one, because they controlled it as well. And that would be quite useful for, as generally speaking, the Roman defensive systems infrastructurally were all over post-Roman Europe for defending, especially by it, as what had been the same Roman need to defend the local population from the steppe peoples, or at least the semi-nomadic ones, including the same peoples that had taken over this area, including the Goths and others. And I wouldn't digress on the obvious reality also that the Romanization has not to do just with the direct Roman occupation or control of an area. Romanization extended up to the Urals, even if the Romans didn't even know they existed factually. So these areas were kind of closer, generally speaking, to civilization that just could support less permanent forces there. And so they also underwent a greater decline than others. The core, say, Mediterranean ones that also underwent, as you know, a crisis, a contraction, and so on. So an archaeological problem, as always, is that most of the most common structures and also tools and buildings in general rotted away, right? And they're not documentable, for which we also have that normal general lack of information for most early medieval Europe, at least, considering especially the places where people were not literate, or at least they weren't so in a meaningful cultural and institutional sense. So most of what the locals actually spoke is not clearly known. You can find an inscription here and there, but do you know what the broader picture really is? Well, it's very hard to get. In any case, the world was always interconnected. These peoples were always in contact, say, with Constantinople, with other areas of Europe, and pretty much they were also probably the same people, right? So also language per se is not necessarily an indicator of ethnic character per se. The Romanization of Europe, as you know, is quite intense, and technically these Danubian areas, let's say from the Central European watershed, were in fact Romanized in language, as opposed to the ones from the Mediterranean watershed that were more Hellenized, right, in the Balkan Peninsula. But the areas even as today is properly the Danube Valley, even Serbia, etc. Even the modern languages still bear witness of the fact that there is an important Latin influence, just as you can find in Western Europe, some areas. So this aspect is very important, because eventually at least the most quoted theory of how Romania spoke, in fact, a Romance language, has been traced to some internal migrations, namely Transhumans, probably from the south, into what is also part of Transylvania, but the most Romance-speaking area was Wallachia, as a matter of fact. But this would have happened in the during the course of the Middle Ages, paradoxically, rather than, say, being a direct continuity with the older Romance settlement that, again, surely was there. There are communities living in Transylvania that surely spoke a Romance language from Roman times till today. Just the point is understanding how meaningful they were in the broader picture, right? And the area, frankly, was mostly Slavicized, right? So that's the actual background, and the reasons why eventually many there are also more concrete reasons connected with contemporary history, with state building, and so national identity that have to do also with the eventual romanization of language of people living in general in these areas that didn't speak a Romance language, right? So even for very recent times, don't think that we actually know too much regarding the, at least, yes, in the contemporary era, we know substantial things also in the modern one, and also since the late Middle Ages, but how this was eventually internalized in terms of today's identity is very different, right? Don't think that any people, and I'm talking about Romania, those who might have actually, a positive bias in general, but for any people in general, being born in a country has literally nothing to do with understanding anything about its history, its language, its general identity, or how the country works. I mean, I wouldn't claim at any time that because I was born in my own country and living here till now, I know the history of my country. It's an extremely stupid thing to even think in the first place, right? And it turns out that the less you know about your country, and the more, not just stupid you are, but in the sense also more likely you are to pretend that you actually do know anything, right? So a bit of humility for anyone involved, starting from myself, but is very welcome, right? So naturally, the same Dacian identity here should be taken in consideration, because between the Getae, the Daci, etc., there's also an important debate still. We know that Romanization was stronger in the provinces of Moesia, as we were saying before, also in Pannonia partly, that also again was not a dramatically prosperous province in the empire, and Dacia too. And again, especially in the cities, in the main centers that surely spread osmotically this Roman culture around. But there were lots of peoples inhabiting this broader region. We're talking about beyond Transylvania, of course, the Illyrians, the Celts, the same Dacians, and others, Sarmatians, etc. Since an early age. And some of these peoples were, in fact, quite blended to the point you couldn't, into each other, to the point you couldn't really even tell who was who with incredible clarity, right? At least there is always an important shade for which it's not that from 1 meter from here starts, I don't know, the Illyrians, and from the other side, the Celts. These broader Central European peoples looked pretty similar to each other in many ways. And they weren't definitely that different even from the Mediterranean ones, telling the truth. In any case, during the migration era, our capacity of understanding from actual sources, like from modern sources, what the previous situation ethno-linguistically could be about is complicated by the waves of other peoples, namely the Germans, the Huns, the Avars, the Slavs, and the Magyars that we'll see today, which settled in Transylvania and in other areas at different times and different ways, also because there were importantly different peoples coming from different areas. And we can be pretty sure that such migratory succession diminished the number of Romance-speaking people. We know that for sure in Pannonia. This is evident also with the Hungarian conquest between 895 and 896 in eastern Pannonia, between the Danube and Tisza rivers. So we're coming close to the boundaries with Transylvania. For which, as we were saying before, also peoples that had a specific ethno-linguistic identity tended to be either eliminated or assimilated most of the times by the Hungarian elements in a broader cultural hegemonic sense, right? This is not entirely, let's say, is not valid for the entire areas which the Hungarians ruled. This is mostly for the aforementioned core land. Famously enough, the surroundings of the Hungarian core land remained somewhat Slavic prevalently, but in the east we find, in other areas we find also this kind of interesting Romance elements and other languages such as the Turks or others. And we know that the Magyars are counted as Ugro-Finns, but there were surely Iranians and Turks among them as well, as there had been also among other peoples. I made a video about the Hunnic identity and the general perception of them, aside from any strictly genetic evidence. That is also, however, not so complicated to interpret, to be honest. At least we have a certain amount of data, and once you have surveyed it in general, yes, complicated aspects remain, but we may have a clear indication of what they were about. And never think again that ethnicity there means just, it's not about genes or language, right? These peoples were very similar in general. I mean, the steppes were a great merger in a way, even though there was a phase in which the Indo-Europeans dominated for a long time, as you know, after the Turks arrived. And when you look at their customs, they were fundamentally similar. But we do know genetically they were different. Also because living in the steppes requires a certain specific type of political and social organization. And also, of course, there were lots of, say, among the so-called Turkic peoples that we, just as we were saying, there were consistent Iranian elements. This is true, for example, for the Bulgars. As they settle in the Balkans, there are, Turkic, but also Iranian inscriptions, as they did for a while after they had settled permanently in the area. Another feature here to consider is always that these peoples never migrated in all together in one shot, right? There were several migrations over time, sometimes also impossible to trace, frankly, that there was a bulk, let's say, that moved within that decade, but there would always be, first of all, together with them, lots of other groups that also had, in a sense, maybe nothing to do from the originary one, also in a broader geographic sense. Whenever there were such migrations, peoples joined from literally everywhere, right? Most of the migration era, for example, presents this phenomenon to the point that, what we call barbarian invasions were carried out in part even by actually Roman subjects that also had nothing, say, against the same Romanity per se, nor we have to think that the migration era was just an ideological struggle along that pattern. In any case, what we see in Transylvania is that the majority of the population always maintained a sedentary lifestyle. I mean, the Daco-Romans were definitely sedentary. The land afforded enough resources to live in a fully settled way. So there was properly no semi-nomadism, except perhaps from transhumans in a broader sense. But let's say any people that eventually settled there, even with that proximity to the steppe, because again, just across the Carpathians you have the steppes, and that's where from some nomadic raiders always keep pouring even within the Carpathian Basin, but generally speaking, they're assimilated, right? The area was kind of more exposed to these waves, where it was actually the same Danubian valley, right, up to Serbia even, right? So that there are deep connections, like Serbia, for example, shows very interesting military influence from the Rus, as opposed to their Croatian neighbors. Basically, they were the same people, but they were instead kind of quite evidently Frankish influence, Western influence in a broader sense. So this picture is important to keep in mind. As we've seen also for other lands abandoned by the Romans in a premeditated way, we've made a video about the kingdom of Kent, and we've seen how the Romans had properly abandoned Britain. Their establishment there had moved into Gaul. Well, so the Aurelian retreat brought to the departure of a significant part of the population, along with the public administration and army. So just think about all the civil administration, their families, craftsmen, traders, the same latifundia owners. So even though we don't know too much about what happened there, we can easily understand that the previous, for example, trade and market system collapsed, right? The Roman system of land ownership kind of dissolved, and surely there was kind of a more evenly distributed wealth in relative terms, even though, again, the area was to be left exposed to attacks, to instability. So that brought to an important impoverishment in the first place. So the general and peaceful attitude towards the fate of the Daco-Romans is that surely they remained, right? They survived all along in some proportion. It's just that their, let's say, civil structure disappeared. And so, as we were saying before, when other peoples came to rule these lands, the locals somewhat also adapted to the identity of their conquerors, right? And it is something very fluid and labile and really also natural, devoid of any dramatic choices. The elites surely were more involved in this, and it was a greater problem for them because they already had some sort of, established identity, role in the community, and so on. But on the longer run, you would just learn how to live over in the generation with the others and marry into them and so on. And the rest of the population was mostly concerned just with essentially surviving, right? Not be raped by a Turkic raider, and just having their surplus to survive the winter. And that was pretty much the standard of most peoples in Europe at the time, because regarding the Turks, mainly in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And in fact, as we will see, the wave of conquerors was intense. We can start from the Goths, that, as you know, we made videos. I re-uploaded recently the old videos about both the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, at least for how we call them in modern terms. And Transylvania was essentially occupied by them after the Roman departure. The Tervingi group that essentially migrated from following the Vistula Valley and crossing the Carpathians at some point, settling there. Surely there were other groups also from the east, from the Black Sea, where the Ostrogoths had what we call as the Ostrogoths had created. In fact, sort of, their Crimean kingdom in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, launching raids in Asia Minor, in Greece, and so on. And that, in fact, figure also the Battle of Adrianople, after the Visigoths had crossed in the Danube from the north, from the broader Gutiuda, right? And of course, what we call Transylvania in modern times was already a bit like this, the main center of their power. Like the Wallachia in the south, so the Danubian Valley was, generally speaking, more like a frontier, right? That would enlarge even over time, because again, in Trajanic times, the Danube was literally the Roman border, and there were cities there, and that's also why the Romans pushed this border north. But as you know, in early high medieval times, the Byzantines had just created this, let's say, hundreds of kilometers long frontier with, in fact, mostly Hungary, and also with the territories depending on them, Transylvania, so that it would be more difficult for the enemies just to come to plunder in the Byzantine heartland that was fundamentally on the Mediterranean coast. And the reason why this land was left kind of a bit on its own, even though technically it was, there was a watershed, the Danube itself, of course. That said, whose land was that? Either the empire, whoever was in the north. The reason why these areas had been gradually left is the broader demographic economic contraction that, again, didn't quite provide the necessary resources for just sending some troops garrisoning the main strongholds, and not really controlling the broader interland. This is a state of things that you see also in Ottoman times, like that there is this wild area almost that about which so many legends and the same Dracula and Bram Stoker, when he talks about all the various ancestors' blood that ran in his veins, which is odd because he actually sucked other people's blood rather than his own, but at least in the surroundings. And actually the historical Dracula was Wallachian, as you know. That has nothing to do with Transylvania, but as we will see, there is also an important connection between, especially with the Banat, right, and not just with Wallachia, but also parts of Serbia and parts of Transylvania as well. In any case, if I don't remember badly, the book says that the Dracula's castle was in the easternmost area of Transylvania, so it should have been essentially the Shagalese frontier or some sort of like that. But yeah, just a literary note. In all this, as you know, the gods had been Christianized, at least their elites, to by Ulfila, who had brought Acacian Arianism in Guthuda. Thus the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes and their imitations became Arians. And albeit the Gothic presence in Transylvania is somewhat transient, mostly during the 4th century, as they moved en masse, other Gothicized peoples kept inhabiting the land and were able to fence off for a while important offensives from other peoples such as the Gepids. As you know, I made a video about them, the Vandals, the Sarmatians. I also discussed them, of course, and we will keep talking about them. And again, the point of Transylvania was having this heavily entrenched area at a relatively short distance from the Balkan, from the Roman Balkans, and so areas that could be plundered regularly by these confederacies that were somewhat big, right? During the migration era, in spite of the internal cohesion of these peoples, who were just basically all different tribes behaving autonomously, but the broader needs of the migration brought them to act somewhat unitarily, and they covered very large areas. I mean, there is no comparison between the political compaction of the migration era and, say, the one of 13th century Europe. And this also shows you how you don't necessarily have to be an extensionally large power to have a meaningful, civilizational quality. But, of course, they were quite punching, and they were bringing with them their own vision of the world, their own ambition, their own strength, that were a bit how they necessarily had to leave, because the collapse of late antiquity had also entailed, for example, the decline of mineral production that during the early Middle Ages, in fact, was not really carried out in Transylvania. There were gold mines, right? And most of the resources necessary to extract the precious metal were too costly, right, for the political and social structures of early medieval Europe. That again was a materially miserable time, especially in these Trans-Danubian areas. Then there is the Hunnic wave. In 376, the Huns, led by Uldin, defeated and expelled the Visigoths, who were being, in fact, pushed by them, and this would bring to the Hunnic occupation of what had been Dacia Inferior, and thus the seizing of the local infrastructures and headquarters by the Huns. Note that even if we know basically nothing of it, there was surely an administrative system that had somewhat survived from Roman times into throughout the Visigothic one. So this would go on somehow. So the Hunnic conquest of Transylvania brought also to the Battle of Adrianople. As we know, Fritigern, a Visigothic leader, appealed first to Roman Emperor Valens in the same year to be allowed to settle with his people on the south bank of the Danube. However, a famine broke out. The Romans were unable to supply the Visigoths or even the same land, so the Goths rebelled against the Romans that were fundamentally also to simply enslave and deport the Visigoths in that situation, and won this clamorous in fact battle of Adrianople that was quite of a exceptional outcome in the first place. In the meanwhile, the Huns fought the Alans, the Vandals, the Quadi. So all these peoples were brought to press against the Roman frontier. I know that there is somebody saying, well, this idea of the domino effect is not really true. We have to understand who these peoples were just elite, whether there was actually a mass movement of people from a certain area into another. These are all matters that we will discuss on some other occasion, but that we already did. I have a pretty hefty migration era playlist, as you know, so if you want to check that out, you'll find surely what suits your curiosity in broad terms. And this is also a time which Pannonia was conquered by the Huns and became the center of their domination during the peak of Attila's reign between 435-453. We don't know exactly where his ring fort really was, where he accumulated all the loot of these broader raids that he had successfully carried out through the same aforementioned peoples. So again, there's no need to digress on this, but it's important to stress that Transylvania was fundamentally within this domination. We found say sets of coins discovered at Sebesh that witness the Hunnic domination. In fact, there are traces of the Huns in the lowlands of the Muresh Valley, especially, and the summer residence of the Huns were seemingly in Transylvania between the 20s of the 5th century, 455. And therefore we can also witness through some archaeological discoveries and other general hints the military presence of the Huns in the land. What appears evident, in my opinion, also during both Hunnic, Avar, and Magyar times is that Transylvania had always this somewhat the same political and strategic role, right? It was somewhat difficult to control by the Western rulers who were mostly, in fact, they were based in the Pannonian Basin, but it would have this kind of still more militarized functionality because the need of the locals to defend against the eastern nomadic peoples was essentially the same of the settled rulers in the Pannonian Basin, right? So this happens sometimes also in other areas of Europe. Think about the Frankish Neustria or Austrasia, or the Longobards, Neustria and Austria. Very often it was the same thing. The richest land were in the west, and when the conquerors had come, they had left important military detachments in the east to secure their rear, and granting also for this military needs some local autonomies that would play sometimes also in a decentralizing sense compared to the core of power in the West, but at different degrees, right? And this is perhaps more evident in this Pannonian Transylvanian case because they are somewhat pretty large areas. As we've seen, they were more difficult to control because of the amount of local resources that wouldn't allow this dramatic state building for a long time. And generally speaking, we're also talking about more militarized peoples, right, that are closer to also to other wilder populations, and that therefore are kind of more, are kind of less civilized, but more prone to loot in also in the surrounding area, especially in Mediterranean areas, in Western European areas. And in fact, as we will see, there is evidence of a Transylvanian participation, for example, in the Magyar raids in Germany and in other areas. And this is pretty much obvious because the local elite was still somewhat co-opted by the Pannonian rulers. Speaking of the spread of Christianity, we've seen the previous Bjertan Donarium, then a clay pot with Christian symbols from Moigrad, another clay pot with a Christogram at the bottom from Ulpia Traiana and others. This Ulpia Traiana, as you know, was the ancient Dacian capital, Sarmizegetus. And this means, of course, that as in other areas of Central Europe, Christianity had spread from an early time, except this region had been also occupied by the Romans, and so that had also probably contributed to the further spread from an earlier era. From the 5th century, we find more artifacts, most of them in the form of oil lamps, with also gold rings with cross incisions, such as at the tomb of Omar in Abhaida, and chest pieces with Christian symbols. The reason why these finds are more frequent for that time is that probably an elite was forming there in kind of a bit more of a monarchic direction. These are also the centuries of the Gepid migration we will see in a while. The Gepids, we made a video about them, and you know that they essentially they took the place of these peoples that had been under the Huns until the latter's empire collapsed, and so they re-emerge also historically from general lack of information. This is a bit what happens for the Goths as kind of autonomous peoples as such, and they settle in the Gepids case in Transylvania, albeit their real center of power is in Sirmium, right on the Danube, in areas that again were more Romanized and closer to the empire, from that they also threaten in part, and that definitely shows the need of these people to try to settle in more developed areas from which they could rule more. During the 6th century, there is a lot of missionary work supported by Justinian I towards the Byzantine northern neighbors, which brings to a further spread of finds dating to that time, ampullae with representation of Saint Menes, cross-shaped pendants, oil lamps, even more frequently than before. This is all connected with the Gepid elite. That was in fact Christian, was Arian, and that had a great importance also in the spread of a specific symbology, probably from this Eastern Germanic background. It was surely very influenced by the earlier Gothic kingdom on the Black Sea, and that in fact merges together with Byzantine art in the representations of angels that somewhat were connected in the Germanic mentality. Of course, the angel here was mostly Saint Michael, archangel, and we have from Sirmium this means having a quite refined art. Of course, it was Byzantine influence, but seemingly the Gepids somewhat pioneered this angelic iconography that also passed onto the Longobards, that, as you know, were fixated with Saint Michael, that they thought was the equivalent of Woden in the general pantheon because of his emphoric and military role. And in fact, the Longobards had settled in Pannonia at the time. The Byzantines were playing with both the Gepids and the Longobards to keep both in check at the same time. You know the story, we made lots of videos about the Longobards. And we will see how things ended in a while. But remaining on the topic of Christianity, we know that within the context of the Bulgarian Khan Boris I conversion to Christianity, we're talking about later times, like in the second half of the 9th century, we can observe in Transylvania already essentially a Byzantine type of church organization, well defined. And there were two archdioceses in the early days of what would have become at least the Kingdom of Hungary, that are connected of course, with both the Eastern and Western Christendom, of course, but that in the case of Transylvania are somewhat more, in fact, Eastern influenced. In fact, there is the Archdiocese of Kalocsa with quote Archdiocese of Turkey, because the Magyars were called the Turks by the Byzantines, because that's how they had been calling the Avars and previously also the Huns, if I'm not wrong, and so was the Turks in general. The Byzantines were fixated with this kind of ethnographic, classicistic traditionalism. And there were, in suborder to these two archdioceses, the ones of Transylvania, of the Banat, and of Senat, Kenat. Also, there is, and we will see him also a bit better, the baptism of Gyula, or Jula, I don't know how you pronounce that, the second. There was a Hungarian tribal leader in the mid-10th century, who in fact went to Constantinople and was baptized as Stephen. And he is a famous figure because, as we will see now, he was basically the second in command among the various Magyar ethnic tribal leaders, right? And he was located in Transylvania. So to stress that connection that we were identifying before between the West, more kind of civilized land, and the eastern frontier, that however was of great strategic significance. And Gyula's daughter would actually be the mother of King Stephen I of Hungary, because she married Gedza the Hungarian Grand Prince. So this shows, of course, important connections with Constantinople in the whole area over time, religious missions and some sort of elite work also for creating a local ecclesiastical administration could back the state building locally. And so the Diocese of Transylvania was established according to the chronology before 1080. We don't know exactly when, though. And as such, it was subordinated to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Maybe the same Geza had done this, we don't know exactly, because the process of conversion took time, but we don't know, say, at least when the first churches were founded. As we've seen, these were probably quite old, but it would be interesting to know what the local administration had worked like. In Alba Iulia, that was named after the same Gyula church built in Eastern tradition, was found recently, I think 10 years ago, and this dates between the second half of the 10th and the first half of the 11th century, so probably that something big was happening in that kind of ecclesiastical direction under these rulers at the time. Also, during the rule of Atum, who was an early 11th century ruler in the territory now known as the Banat in present Romania and Serbia, who was baptized in Vidin, that is a port city on the southern bank of the Danube in northwestern Bulgaria, in fact in Banat. Towards the end of the 10th century, a monastery of Eastern Rite monks was active in Kenat, right, which is in Timiș County, Romania. So as we were saying before, the Gepids under Ardaric, just as early as 455, after Attila's death, conquered Pannonia and settled for 2 good centuries in Transylvania. And also, as we will see, while their power was disgregated by the Avars and the Longobards, still the descendants of the Gepids remained in the region. The Gepids, as we've seen, put their hands also on the important river way of the Sava and the Danube, the Tisza, so between Sirmium and Singidunum, an incredibly strategic knot of the broader Danubian frontier. That's also what the wars with the Longobards probably revolved around, even though most of the clashes occurred between the Danube and the Tisza. That also became kind of it was that corridor through which also that had laid between Dacia and Pannonia historically, and the Sarmatians had poured into a reason for which the Romans also conquered Dacia, to kind of strangle them from both sides. So you see the same areas, militarized border zones, and Transylvania, all this was sheltered by those events in the open plains. Not that those were easy territories either. They were quite marshy and, again, poorly inhabited and always open to this kind of attacks and, unstable control. So things within the Carpathian Basin were relatively easier, right, surrounded by hard terrain. On one occasion, we know that in 539, cooperating with the Franks, the Gepids crossed the Danube and devastated Moesia, killing the Magister Militum Calloc. But the situation kind of reversed itself when the Ostrogoths moved. That also had essentially presented a problem with the Gepids, as they had reappeared and coalesced after Attila's death in the same region, that had moved into Italy and secured an important area that stretched from that controlled basically all the peninsula part of the Tyrrhenian islands, Provence, the north, the Alps up to the Danubian, into the Danubian valley, and running in fact east across it up to the same Sirmium and Singidunum, right? In fact, the Ostrogoths were able to defeat the Gepids that were allied with the Swabians, the Scyrians, the Sarmatians at the Battle of Bolia in 469 under their leader Theodomir. and also the Battle of Sirmium. And so much that the Gepids under King Traustila lost the same city that again was the most important cornerstone of the Danubian middle Danube fundamentally, and his successors also failed to recapture it even after Theodoric the Great's death. The same Vitiges managed to defeat the Gepids again in the air. So you understand they're from Italy, this Ostrogoth projectional capacity secured also importantly the Danubian frontier, and that the Gepids at that point were mostly dwelling just within Transylvania, didn't have too much potential even to assert control on an area that was much closer to them than it was to the center of Ostrogothic power. And archaeological studies have proven that the aforementioned, say, abundance of aristocratic graves actually corresponded to a grim social reality, because the Gepids had surely won a very important place in Central Europe, especially they had been active protagonists of the Hunnic demise, and their elites became very rich and powerful, but at the expense of the rest of the population that grew weaker. So they had very strong elites, but not that kind of more distributed wealth among the freemen. And this seemingly was a very important factor in the wars against the Longobards, who were similar people, Germanic stock. The Gepids were Eastern Germans, the Lombards were essentially Elbe Germans. Some call them Eastern too, but it's just a didactic repetition. As the latter had actually a much more evenly distributed wealth, even the common kind of freemen tombs are well provided, very often with swords, with consistent equipment. And the Longobards crushed the Gepids multiple times till the final one in 567, when, however, it was also the Avar settlement in the Carpathian Basin that was beginning at the time that inflicted to the Gepidic kingdom the final blow. Right, the Longobards and the Avars had allied themselves. The Avars at this time were not the mighty power that they would have become in a couple of generations, because they were all kind of fragmented. They didn't have a single ruler, so this also gave enough time to the Longobards migrating into Italy, also making a pact with the Avars to kind of retain part of the Pannonian lands in case the migration had failed, which wouldn't happen. But it shows that the Avars were kind of, well, okay, nobody really liked to have such neighbors from both sides, let's say. But this shows that, the Avar impact also probably on the Longobard-Gepidic wars was less, dramatic than is normally stated, right? I heard multiple people needing to stress that the Avars were, a superpower because they had, ultra heavy cavalry and were so powerful. Well, power in those times is about political cohesion. And until the Avars were political cohesed, they were a power to be reckoned with, but not this radical game changer that they would have become later on, right? They, as you know, even besieged Constantinople. They launched raids into Merovingian Germany, and also they did harass the Longobards later on their eastern frontier. But also they stayed fundamentally in Pannonia. After having occupied in fact also the same Transylvania, most of the Gepidic archaeological sites are concentrated in the cemeteries, fundamentally of the Banat region. So not in the heart of Transylvania, but as we've seen in this most urbanized area on the Danube, that still was, however, intertwined with the broader kingdom territory. And the Gepids were assimilated by the Avars, right? So talking about the Avars, that in 568 under the Kagan Bayan I established an empire first in the Carpathian Basin and then expanding in Pannonia, we have in fact, massive power being built that would last for 2.5 centuries, albeit gradually declining after, especially during the 8th century, as you know, they were eventually crushed also by the Carolingians, and they dissolved without too much ado. So this is a bit normal in the broader scale of things, especially in early medieval times. I mean, the Magyars at the end managed to form a state and to work on it. The others somewhat exhausted their strength. They were crushed by the Carolingians, and there was this wide gap that would be filled by the Magyars in a sense, but that had brought also the Bulgars, at that time already the Bulgarians, to even extend part of their control on Transylvania. There were other peoples together with the Avars, such as we're talking mostly about Turks, as the Avars were themselves largely. In 595, the Kuturgurs, in 670, the Onogurs. These are peoples that migrated into the Avar Khaganate, even beyond, right? Some were settled by the Longobards, for example, in central Italy, but these are yet other peoples that left their mark in Transylvania as well. However, the most important ethnic, changer here was the Slavization. And you know that there is a lot of debate regarding the Slavic migrations, because there is a bit more of a Stalinian idea that remained in historiography regarding the fact that this people essentially living around the Pripyat area, after all the other peoples had somewhat stopped, especially the Germans that had settled, began to expand in the territories that were left open, and having kind of a less of a political military cohesion. They expanded more individually, right? There were important Slavic coalitions, but objectively, yes, you hardly find anything so big or powerful as what had been the Germanic peoples or the Steppe peoples as they had moved. And so the Slavs essentially is settled as a tide, also in multiple waves, and we have seen this partly made in spring some videos about the Avars, the Slavs, and their settlement and so on. Very often also at following the same Avars that were called in this regard shepherds of peoples, because they were habituated in the steppes to crush the opponents and to lead their relics as somewhat lesser people that would pave the way for their elite's advance in a broader sense. Naturally, I think it's a bit more complex, but yes, there is a substantial Slavic migration in these areas. Of course, most of the previous population became equally Slavicized from a cultural point of view. So what I always get with these videos about Eastern Europe, it's always a problem for some reason to talk about this and about ethnicities, etc. This never happens for other regions, right? You get always these comments, I know exactly how many millions of these peoples moved. They were not as many as this and that. Yes, exactly. You know exactly how many millions these people were. Yeah, congratulations. You have, very advanced demographic tools to absolutely, calculate how many people's settle. Of course, there is not even a timeline there because it's a lot of bullshit. But the point being that they want to say that, of course, the people that inhabit today those lands are the same that existed before also Islamic migration. So the Islamic migration, it's not that they didn't happen, but they were somehow less impacting than we think. They were impacting, as a matter of fact, both demographically and culturally, and the proof being simply that, that's more or less what linguistically what we can see today, and also from a genetic point of view, we see that the thing happened. And of course, yes, we see also there was a blend with the previous population. What's the problem? Why is there always an issue about something so elementary that I don't understand? Or better, I wish I didn't understand, but unfortunately I do, because of the aforementioned thing of saying, my country. Who the fuck cares about your country, whichever it is? I mean, including mine. This is not how you render a service to it. Stop with this bullshit. So, seemingly, the Magyar county system that would be reaffirmed by King Saint Stephen I later on, and so becoming the base of the same Kingdom of Hungary administration, was likely based on the our one. Right, it was normal for also the original tribes to have settled in a district that they controlled, and they had through which they had essentially first governed over the subject peoples, then kind of developed their elites further, and having started also to provide infrastructurally to facilitate the military expeditions and so on. So everything happened very gradually, and most of the system relied, as we've seen, also on loot, and so this capacity of gathering a surplus, not from the local territory that wouldn't provide as much, and capitalizing upon. When we look at the Magyars, from a genetic point of view, after their settlement in Hungary, we see that there is an important also Sarmatian and Hunnic genetic component. Right, these are peoples that had surely married into the Magyar elites locally, or also when they were still in the steppes. Right. However, when we look at and these are traces, right? So when we look at the broader Magyar population in this time, we realize that they were somewhat European genomically. So the majority of the people too, because again, we at some point also the elite cannot be distinguished much from the previous population, the subjects. And the cemeteries of Magyar commoners, in fact, had fewer Asian genomes than the cemeteries of the Hungarian elite. And we can find even some important continuity, in fact, of the local population in general since the Bronze Age. So in spite of all the various peoples, movements, and so on, as always, most areas in Europe do not really change. And these are, by the way, in Central Europe, some of the ones that change the most. So the change, in fact, is significant, but it's not radical. Right? There is no such thing like a ethnic substitution or whatever. So it's important to stress it, especially the Pannonian Basin was the receiver of so many different peoples, especially the ones that arrived straight from the steppes in Europe. The Magyars took over the Carpathian Basin in a pre-planned manner. Right? They moved in for a long time between 862 and 895. According to an 11th century tradition, the road taken by the Magyars under Prince Almos took them first to Transylvania in 895, and this kind of makes some sense because it was at least between the steppes and the Pannonian Basin. And there is even a Rusian tradition that says how the Magyars had moved into the Carpathian Basin, passing through the Kievan Rus. And the sacred leader of the Magyar Great Principality, the aforementioned Prince Almos, died before he could reach Pannonia, according to tradition, so that he was sacrificed in Transylvania. However, we don't have any evidence from the actual times that the Magyars crossed the eastern Carpathian Mountains into Transylvania from the steppes. There is even here the debate of how much the local population had maintained a Daco-Roman identity as opposed to Slavization. And in fact, the other side mostly stresses instead some essentially Slavic and even Turkic base for the locals. But the reality was likely they were all blended, also in a quite indestructible way. The presence of the Slavs is archaeologically confirmed, at least, and as we've seen, the Romanian one is more complicated. The earliest Magyar artifacts found in Transylvania date to the first half of the 10th century. So while we don't know the exact year of conquest, more or less it fits the canonic timeline. There are horse burials there, which is very similar to the Hunnic type. And in fact, this was not just a Hunnic thing, but considering that only the Hungarians used partial horse burials, we think that there may have been some Hunnic trace also within them. Again, either locally or from the steppes. And this is also, as we've seen, genetically demonstrated. And in many ways, traditions are without color, right? The horse burials are to be found even among the Longobards, but this doesn't mean that, or the Goths or whatever, but this doesn't mean that it's because they were of Hunnic descent. But surely their people was Hunnicized, let's say, by a prolonged contact with the Huns and with the imitation of some steppes models of power that equated to actually great prestige, because horses cost a freaking lot, and so if you can't afford being buried with one, it really proves that you are wealthy enough, and that's basically your broader mindset, the one of the warrior, the one of the ruler and the leader on horseback. So this is quite important, mostly from a political and cultural point of view. Some recently excavated graves, such as the ones near Oraste, Zsásváros in Hungarian, have been attributed to the aforementioned Gyula tribe, that again was essentially the second most prestigious in the Magyar tribal federation in the 9th and 10th centuries. It would witness the necessity of the Magyars to secure their eastern frontier with some powerful control, but also naturally leading to some autonomization of the same tribe locally. And this archaeological find was part of a broader permanent settlement on the top of a hill, right, suggesting the Magyar control over the Mureș Valley in the center of Transylvania. That's also where we more or less the same time where we find the coin minted under Berthold, Duke of Bavaria, who ruled between 938 and 947 near Turda, right in Cluj County in St. Transylvania, which suggests the Transylvanian Hungarians participated in Western military campaigns. As you know, the Magyars were essentially crushed by the Germans at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, so much that they stopped raiding into Germany. Right, for a while they turned against the Byzantines in the Balkans until 970, but they also essentially realized that the broader European powers were consolidating to a point that continuing with that kind of raiding policy was just anachronistic. And speaking of Gyula's clan, well, this probably ruled Transylvania in the 10th century. Gyula II, as we've seen, was this powerful leader in the mid of the century, ruling from Alba Iulia, which, aside from the name, actually doesn't derive from the ancient Roman domination, but actually from Gyulethar var in Hungarian, that in Romanian becomes Alba Iulia, because it would mean White Castle of the Iula, right? So Alba stands for that kind of whiteness, as you know, so in the broader Indo-European language. Iulia has to do with Iula, right? And this center had been already important. In fact, in Roman times it was Apulum, and it witnesses the obvious continuity with the previous infrastructures as a broader political and strategic center, and it would be kind of obvious that the clan would have its base there. Ioannis Skylitzes, Byzantine chronicler, says that around 952, consider he was writing from the 11th century, Gyula II visited Constantinople, that he was baptized, as we said before, that Emperor Constantine VII lifted him from the baptismal font himself, emphasizing the deep connection between this clan and the Byzantines that naturally were already in antipathetic terms with the Magyars, and so the Transylvanian decentralized position was of extreme relevance. And consider that the Bulgarians were between Transylvania and Constantinople still, and that was always that friction also, in fact, between the Magyars and the Bulgarians, and so it was a very side-switching reality there according to the circumstances, the internal policies of these countries, and so on. Also, a bishop named Hierotheos accompanied Gyula II back to Transylvania, becoming the first bishop of the land in the process. And that's when Gyula II built the first church of Transylvania in Alba Iulia, around the mid-century. Everything kind of adds up to this. As we were saying before, also Sarold, daughter of Gyula II, would marry Gedza, the Grand Prince of the Magyars, around 970, and their son, Vajk, that was born around 975, became properly the first king of Hungary in 1000, as King Stephen I of Hungary, which was one of the greatest accomplishments of the Western world, right? Both of the Western Empire and the Western Church, essentially bringing Hungary within the orbit, in fact, of the broader, say, Germanic world that, as we've seen, had tamed the Magyar raids, and also the spiritual communion of the Roman Catholicism. This would be quite relevant because, as we have discussed also in several videos, because Roman Constantinople had been struggling over the conversion of the various Balkan and Central European peoples, and the Roman victory over Hungary was enormous in the broader picture, even though Hungary kept being particularly influenced by the Byzantine Empire, and Transylvania even more so, right? Because it historically remained characteristically more closer to Eastern Christendom. Now, an excursus on the Gesta Hungarorum is quite meaningful. You know that the Gesta Hungarorum, or the Deeds of the Hungarians, is the earliest book about Hungarian history which has survived to posterity. It was written between the 12th and the 13th century. There's some doubt maybe on how this actually happened. Mostly there is a problem, as we'll see now, regarding some of the informations that this source introduces, because it talks specifically to Transylvania of some leaders that had, according to the Gesta, historically existed, but of whom we don't find any evidence, any other evidence other than the Gesta itself which naturally affects the way we look at Transylvanian history, Romanian history later, because especially the figures of Gelu, Glad, and Menu Morut may have been somewhat invented by the anonymous author of the Gesta, which, however, is still an important historical, assessment on the on what in fact the Transylvanian reality could be, more or less plausibly at the time. And as we'll see, the areas that are indicated under these characters' rule are somewhat in fact historical. They were surely more or less acting in the way that is described by the Gesta. It's just the figures may be invented, like maybe they resume the actions of different rulers. They are made up a bit to show off with Hungarian deeds and so on. So the first character, Gelu, is described as quidam blacus, so some kind of black, or prince of the blacks, ducem dux blacorum, and controlling a part of Transylvania which was inhabited by the blacks and the Slavs, blasi et sclavi in the Gesta. And according to the story, he was defeated by one of the 7 Hungarian dukes, that was Teuton, right? That would occur essentially in the moment of settlement of, at least according to the story, of this tribal leader in Transylvania, beyond the woods, as we will see now, ultra silvas. And it's been suggested that Gelu was created by the author of the Gesta after the name of the village of Gyalu, that is a Transylvanian village, in fact, in the mountains of the same place, where Gelu dies in the Gesta, killed by the Hungarians. And some have wanted to identify in the aforementioned Blasi, not the blacks, but people of the Bulaks, that is a Turkic tribe of the Karluks from the Altai Mountains, right? And but this is maybe anecdotic. So briefly reading the translation of the Gesta about Gelo, then Tutum, as is called in the source, having heard of the goodness of that land, so talking about Transylvania, sent his envoys to Duke Arpad, that, as you know, is the founder of the Arpadian dynasty that ruled Hungary through the grand princes that were essentially these primi inter pares within the other Magyars up to essentially the 14th century. To ask his permission to go beyond the woods, so literally ultra silvas, so Transylvania, to fight Duke Gelo. So this guy inhabited within Transylvania, according to the source. Duke Arpad, having taken counsel, commented Tutum's wish, and he gave him permission to go beyond the woods to fight Duke Gelo. When Tutum heard this from an envoy, he readied himself with his warriors, and having left his companions there, went forth eastwards beyond the woods against Gelo, Duke of the Vlachs, Blasi. Gelu, Duke of Transylvania, hearing of his arrival, gathered his army and rode speedily towards him in order to stop him at the Meshes gates. But Tutum, crossing the wood in one day, arrived at the Almas river. Then both armies came upon each other with the river lying between them. Duke Gelo planned to stop them with his archers. And this location is in the far northeast of Hungary, into the northwest of Transylvania, geographic. So then there is the other character, Galad in Hungarian, which actually is an infamous name, right? It comes from the Magyar word Galad, which means perfidious, vile, atrocious, dishonest, possibly from the medieval Latin Goliardus, Galliardus, that, as you know, also made a video about the Goliards, and so you can check there what was the broader point of it. So some kind of chthonic monster at the end of the day against the Apollonian power of the conquerors. So these are treated as rebels, as you understand, as well. But the broader context does fit. After all, this again, Pannonian need to wage campaigns to try to settle, to colonize better this eastern frontier, because it was less controllable. We have seen it also in the video about Moldavia, as some Transylvanian noblemen fundamentally created Moldavia as a domination through their also their broader Hungarian background, because they were, aside from the ethnicity, under the Kingdom of Hungary. These areas would remain. As you know, the Magyars created a sort of empire rather than just a kingdom, or these other various peoples. So Glad. So also this episode takes place at the moment of the Magyar conquest of the Carpathian Basin. Glad came from Vidin in Bulgaria, and he said to have occupied the land that stretches from the river Mureș up to the castle of Orshova and Palanca, with the help of the Cumans, which makes the thing a bit uncertain, because the Cumans did not arrive in those areas before the mid-11th century, so this may have been properly made up by the Gesta. But it's not so strange that these peoples would still use other, say nomadic neighbors of some sort, right? So maybe the source is imprecise about that, but it was plenty of kind of this nomadic scum roaming around, marauders, mercenaries, etc., that the local, more sedentarized princes could use in their service. So according to the Gesta, Glad commanded a great army of horsemen and foot soldiers. So this has the fasces of a sedentary army. Even though, also, as you know, Bulgaria had an important equestrian bias. The steppes were close, and the Saint Magyars, after all, were coming from there. This army was reinforced, allegedly, in fact, by the Cumans, by the same Bulgarians, and by the Vlachs in the source. So the Magyars sent an army against Glad, who was defeated, his army destroyed, and in the process 2 dukes of the Cumans and 3 knights of the Bulgarians were killed in combat. And this is more or less what we get. The passage from the Anonymous of the Gesta says, "And because God with his grace went before the Hungarians, he gave them a great victory, and their enemies fell before them as hay before reapers." Beautiful. And in that battle, 2 dukes of the Cumans and 3 princes, the Kenedzi of the Bulgarians, were slain, and Glad, their duke, escaped in flight, but all his army, melting like wax before flame, was destroyed at the point of the sword. Then Suard, Kaduz, and Boita, having won victory, these are the Magyars, setting from there, came to the borders of the Bulgarians and encamped beside the Ponucea river. Duke Glad, having fled, as we said above, for fear of the Hungarians, entered Kiev, the Kiev castle, and on the 3rd day Zuardu, Kaduz, and Boita, from whom the Bruska kindred descends, So you see the Jester saying, these are the guys that, we remember that are the ancestors of today's clans, even though probably they didn't have much of a, accountable genealogy aside from oral tradition. Having arranged their army, began to fight against Keva Castle. So you understand, even just by this setting, the degree of militarization of this, of those times, and how it was remembered by the Magyars themselves. So yes, it was probably a peaceful settlement in the areas that needed kind of more protection, but surely in places like Transylvania, even though there was a Magyar settlement, the locals were, as always, not very happy of anyone settling there. Menu Morut, in Hungarian Marot, if I pronounce correctly, was the rule instead of the lands between the rivers Mureş, Somes, and Tisza at the time of the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin. By the way, what I forgot to say is that Duke Glad ruled instead from essentially the region of Banat. As we've seen, it says he came from Bulgaria, but it really means this broader area between Bulgaria, Romania, and Transylvania. So from the south, actually, and we're not talking even necessarily of properly Transylvanian power. Instead, this guy here, Menu Morut, comes from properly northwestern Transylvania, so also the frontier with the Pannonian Basin. Here we are around 900 AD, always more or less. And according to the Gesta, Menu Morut's duchy was populated primarily by Khazars and Shekelis, who acknowledged the suzerainty of the Byzantines at the time, right? And the Gesta even says that Menu Morut communicated, quote, hotly with a Bulgarian heart. Whatever this means sounds like these are the westernmost Transylvanians. So they are the hardest, the most difficultly Khazar Shekelis types, right? The Shekelis, at least historically, were at least in the easternmost frontier of Transylvania. The Khazars here are a bit kind of randomly called. I mean, this may have been traveling groups that settled there, maybe had some relevance there, but this fact also that Menu Morut was a bit of a Bulgarian at heart sounds like, this is probably a very Transylvanian guy, but he's kind of a Bulgarian bitch, right, from a Magyar perspective. So the idea is to somewhat say these are not real, these are people that we don't owe anything to. They're just that enemy that we know is from that other country, and incidentally instead rules from a very Transylvanian land. So it may be a piece of Hungarian propaganda during the 12th to 13th century regarding these, again, otherwise unknown characters that are not documented for the previous time. So they may have also been invented in this kind of also ethnic mask that is not quite clear, telling the truth. And the passage says, quote, after spending several days, Duke Arpad, having taken the advice of his noblemen, sent envoys to the castle of Bihar, the Duke of Menu Morut, asking him by right of his forebear, King Attila. This is very important because that's the Shagly thing, to give him the land from the Zomos river to the border of Mir, up to the Meshes gate. This is similar to the first guy in location. At Portam Medzesinam, literally says, it was a pass, and he sent him gifts, just as he had previously sent to Salan, Duke of Titel, Duci Titulensi in the text, and in that embassy were sent two of the most energetic warriors, Vsubu, father of Zolotsu, and Velech. From those progeny Turda, the bishop, is descended So again, these are all heroes that, you realize the pattern. There are these houses that rule in Hungary, and so the Gesta have to say, okay, let's make a story for each one of them, by saying that their ancestor did something cool against these foreign enemies. For these were the most noble by birth, like the others that set forth from the Scythian land, and who followed Duke Almos with a great host of peoples. Right. And the story goes on. The Magyars besieging sees Menu Morut's fortress at Biharia, and this brings him to apologize for his Bulgarian sympathies, right? And he offers his daughter in marriage to Zoltan, that was the son of Arpad himself. So this is even more remarkable. Says, sorry, you're the right guys, I was wrong, and here's my daughter. And the Arpads descend from her, and so from him too. As Arpad was already the Grand Prince of the Magyars. So the Chronicle states that Menumorut dies without a son before 907. So as a consequence, Zoltan, his son-in-law, seizes his entire father-in-law's possessions in that area. This is yet another foundational say, okay, since then those guys have the land. There's also Aitoni that was also ruling in the Banat, right, in the early 11th century. Allegedly, he would descend from Glad, according at least to the Gesta themselves. And Aitoni thus is the bad guy as well, because, good blood doesn't lie. He was descending from the evil guy of the situation. He is also evil. In fact, what does he do to trigger the Magyars? He taxes the salt that was normally shipped along the Muras River into the Tisza, and from there controlled by, at the time, King Stephen of Hungary, who sends Xanad, that was Aitoni's former commander-in-chief, against him at the head of a large royal Hungarian army. And Xanad is the first count of the, in fact, Xanad County in the kingdom. He naturally defeats and kills Aitoni. And he, the city where he rules from is called after him. And that's yet another example of how essentially the Magyars needed, still in the 12th, the 13th century, to reaffirm their own historical rights on these frontier areas that they didn't quite directly control. We made a bit about the Kingdom of Hungary recently, and we've seen how all these various powerful magnates that descended, as you understand from the Gesta, reflecting the politics and society of the time, these great clans, originally, or presumably, at least that's what they wanted to hear, and it was substantially true. I mean, as a broader clans, they would, right? It was difficult to dynasticize succession and so on in Hungary, but that's what was happening. But there was also the problem of securing the frontier areas that were hardly controlled by the king in a direct way, and through still these clans that naturally had difficulties to also control their own lands in some ways, and especially in the frontier, where again there were, generally speaking, hostile peoples that were perceived, as you understand from the stories, as kind of winking at foreign powers, and it was probably also true, because of course they received a support as proxy forces and so on, and that shows here pretty well with essentially the two frontiers are in 4 episodes. 2 are the Banat and 2 are northwestern Transylvania. So you understand that was a bit the limit of the Hungarian power in practice, right, of the Pannonian Basin. And thus Transylvania does figure a bit as a different thing, and we will see better in another video about later medieval Transylvania, what this autonomous power properly consisted in, because it's frankly very interesting as the region also increases in importance because of the mineral resources that are ever more efficiently extracted and so on. So there are many things at stake. We've seen also the salt mines. Consider that was a Silk Road branch that entered Europe through the Danube Valley, so the Banat partly controlled that too. And the Transylvanians had ambitions also from the other side of the Carpathians, as we've seen in that video about Moldavia. But for today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.